The European Union enacted the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, in May 2018. A year later, there is mounting evidence that Europe's new data privacy law has had severe and widespread unintended consequences. Here are 10 of the most significant problems we've seen to date. GDPR negatively affects the EU economy. In a survey of professionals working on mergers and acquisitions, more than half reported working on transactions that failed to go through because of concerns about the GDPR. The GDPR drains company resources. The 500 largest companies in the world have spent an estimated $7 billion in compliance costs for this law. And the total keeps rising. There are even online tools that have been created to weaponize the GDPR by sending companies requests that they must now legally respond to or face penalties. The GDPR hurts European tech startups. In the year after the GDPR, the overall venture funding for EU tech firms decreased by an average of $14.1 million per month per country. This decrease in investment for young ventures caused by the GDPR could result in losses of up to 30,000 jobs in Europe. The GDPR reduces competition in digital advertising. Advertisers have lost market reach in the EU, particularly smaller companies who lost between 18 and 31% between April and July 2018, while Google's tracking code appears on even more sites. The GDPR is too complicated for businesses to implement. In a survey of data protection professionals, more than half of respondents say their organization is far from compliant or will never be able to comply with the law. The GDPR has failed to increase consumer trust. The law, which the EU has touted as the gold standard for data protection rules, has had virtually no impact on consumer trust in the digital economy. 6 months after the GDPR went into effect, consumer trust in the internet was at its lowest in a decade. The GDPR negatively impacts users' online access. 2 months after the GDPR went into effect, a third of the largest US news websites had to block access to the EU as they had not yet managed to comply, and as of March of this year, over 1,100 sites were still blocked. The GDPR is too complicated for consumers to understand. Nearly 2/3 of Europeans have never heard of the GDPR or do not know exactly what it is. And even among those who are aware of the law, in many countries, a majority do not know whom to turn to with a privacy complaint. The GDPR is not consistently implemented across member states. As of May 2019, Greece, Portugal, and Slovenia still had not fully adopted national legislation to comply with the GDPR. The GDPR strains the resources of regulators. The UK's Information Commissioner's Office said its staff were overwhelmed by companies over-reporting potential data breaches because of concerns about high penalties, and the French Data Protection Authority declared that its resources were insufficient to enforce the GDPR. 1 year after implementation, the evidence is compelling and overwhelming. The GDPR is hurting businesses, workers, consumers, and innovation. It's time to reform the GDPR.